second code is 40 to 60 times faster than the first one. So the first approach takes 407 seconds for 1000 API calls, and for the same amount of API calls, the second approach takes only 6 seconds. It's 60 times faster than the first approach. In this video, I'm going to explain why and how it is doing that much faster. So keep watching till the end. So the first approach, basically what we need to do, we need to call an API endpoint for 1000 API calls. Actual scenario, it was like 100,000 API calls, but for this demo purpose I have limited to only 1000 API calls. So I need to call this endpoint for 1000 API calls. So we need to call 1000 API calls in this endpoint and save the response as a JSON in this particular folder. You can see I do have 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on JSON file, and it saves each response into one JSON file. Okay, so basically at the start I'm just starting the timer to measure the total time, and I'm specifying URLs, headers, and if we don't have this schools directory, then it will create that. But if we do have that, then it will remove all the old responses. Okay, so I'm just saying os.path.exist, and it just check that okay, if we have this schools directory, then it will just remove all the files, and then it will create the directory so that we have an empty directory. And then I'm starting from number 1 to number 1000 because I need to call 1000 API calls to this particular endpoint. Okay, so I'm just using request library, and then I'm just saying okay, with request dot session, so that it calls all the API into one session, so it will be a little bit faster. Okay, but still it's like 40 times slower than the second one. Okay, so I'm just saying okay, create a session, set the headers, and then just run this API endpoint for 1000 times. Okay, and then I'm just printing that okay, how much it is processed so far after every 1000 API calls, so that I can see okay, how much it is processed so far. Then I'm just calling this API like session.get, and then I'm checking that okay, if the response status is 404, that means not found, then it will just continue with the next one. Okay, and then I'm just opening this JSON file and then dumping that response data to this JSON file, and that's it. That's what I'm doing in this particular code. Okay, and I'm using basically request library. Okay, and then I'm just printing that okay, what is the finished processing time. And as I showed you earlier, that it took around 4000 seconds to do this 1000 API calls. But in the second approach, what I did differently is that instead of using the request library, I have like the same thing like start time base URL and headers, removing the folders and make directory. So instead of using the request library, what I'm using async IO. Okay, and then I'm using bounded semaphore. So what this will do, it will just limit the concurrent request to only 100 at a time. Okay, basically async IO runs multi-processing, so it will just call the API endpoint with like let's say first one, and then it's waiting for the response. So instead of waiting for the response and then writing and then call again, what it will do, it will once it will hit that endpoint and it's waiting for the response, it will go and request another data in that particular endpoint. So the first one is still not finished yet, so it's still waiting for the response. But in the meantime, when it is waiting for the response, it will call the endpoint for another data. Okay, or it will call the endpoint for another data, and it's waiting for that second one. Is still the first one and second one is not finished yet, or maybe finished. If it is finished, then it will save that, but if it is not finished, then it will go and then call that same endpoint for another data set. Okay, so basically it's calling this endpoint up to 100 times concurrently. Okay, and then it's receiving the responses and then saving that into a JSON file. So that's the only trick that I'm using. Okay, instead of calling one by one and waiting for the response and then saving it, once you are waiting for the response, call that endpoint for another data set and then wait, and then call another, call again and call again and call again. Okay, so instead of just waiting for the response, and once you receive that response then save and then call again, so you are just concurrently sending 100 requests and then waiting, and then once you receive that response you are saving that particular response back. Only that's the difference. So I'm using semaphore, bounded semaphore, and limiting to 100 concurrent request. Okay, and that's it. Only that's the difference. Okay, so we have this URL, we have this async with semaphore. So I'm using instead of waiting and then receiving and then saving, I'm just using an asynchronous process. Okay, so it will once it hits that waiting period, it will call the same endpoint for another data. Okay, and once it receives the first call response, it will save that. Okay, so I'm using asynchronous process, and then async with session.get. I'm just receiving the response and then I'm checking. It's the same thing. Okay, I'm checking the status, getting the data, and then saving that data to this JSON file, and that's it. Only that's the difference. Okay, so we are creating 1000 tasks. You can see for number in range, start number and end number. So I'm creating 1000 tasks, and this is that concurrent calls that will be handed over this particular call. Okay, AO8 async io.gather, and then I'm just handing over 100 API calls at a time. Okay, so and that's it. Only that's the difference. So instead of using the request, I'm using async io, and that's the reason the second approach is almost 60 times faster than the first approach. That's it for this video. If you find this video helpful, consider subscribing, and you will find all the codes in the description below. Thank you.